Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a deeply complex and, honestly, incredibly urgent mystery. We're going to look right past all those usual political talking points and dive straight into the hard data to uncover the true roots of xenophobia in South Africa.
Now, I want you to consider a kind of jarring thought. What if xenophobia isn't actually about foreigners at all? I know, it sounds wild. We naturally just assume that hostility toward immigrants is driven by things like a fight for jobs, or crime, or immigration policy, right? But the research we're unpacking today is going to create some massive cognitive dissonance for you because it proves those assumptions are, well, fundamentally wrong.
To really grasp why this matters, we have to look at the stark reality on the ground. In 2008 alone, 62 people were tragically killed in these explosive waves of anti-immigrant violence. And unfortunately, this wasn't just some isolated historical event. Tensions flared into deadly violence again in 2015, and that hostility, it remains a really dangerous, ever-present undercurrent even today.
The sheer scale of this issue is literally shocking. Surveys show that roughly 1 in 3 South Africans report they would actually take part in collective action against immigrants. We're talking about things like preventing them from moving into a neighborhood or operating a local business. So we're not just dealing with some tiny fringe group of bad actors here. It is a massive, systemic crisis.
Okay, let's dive into this. To truly figure out what's driving this crisis, we're grounding our entire investigation in some incredibly rigorous and partial research. Specifically, we're leaning on Afrobarometer Working Paper number 173. It's this massive study that combines individual survey data with municipal census indicators. We are simply going to follow exactly where the numbers lead us.
We have to start with the biggest, most famous theory in the room. It's what researchers call the resource competition myth. You know the one. It's that highly logical assumption we all tend to make. When the economy tanks, people fight over scarce resources. Therefore, locals attack immigrants because they are directly competing for the exact same jobs and housing. Makes sense, right?
Well, actually scratch that, because we are about to bust that myth entirely. We all assume there's this classic narrative of job theft and housing competition pushing people to their breaking point. But the actual data? It tells a completely different story. When researchers look really closely, the evidence for economic competition driving xenophobia is just incredibly weak. It's inconsistent. In fact, the hard numbers completely upend that classic narrative.
Just consider this totally counterintuitive reality. If the whole competition theory were true, then the people actively out there looking for jobs would be the most hostile toward immigrants, right? I mean, that's who they're competing with. But no, the data shows the exact opposite. People actively competing in the labor market are actually less hostile. The absolute highest levels of xenophobic aggression come from those who are entirely disengaged from the labor force. We're talking about people who have just completely given up on the system altogether.
Now, what's really interesting here is what happens when the source data breaks this down by demographic. A really striking pattern emerges among Black respondents. Being completely disengaged from the labor market dramatically spikes hostility, and it happens exactly during prime working years, between ages 25 and 49. So it's not the act of competing that fuels the anger. It's the total, crushing despair of being left out of the economy entirely.
And this is what allows us to pivot away from that broken economic myth and look right at the verified driver hiding in the data. Xenophobia in this context is absolutely not some calculated economic strategy. It is a profound, deeply rooted psychological reaction. The real driver? It's intense, unyielding frustration.
But here's the thing. When we talk about frustration, perception matters way more than reality. The data reveals the power of this concept called relative deprivation. Imagine a citizen, maybe they even have a job, but they look around at their peers and just feel entirely left behind. They feel economically trapped compared to their neighbors, watching everyone else move forward while they are just stuck in the mud. It's this deeply negative economic outlook, this overwhelming feeling of thwarted expectations that creates a perfect breeding ground for hostility.
But internal frustration almost always needs an external target, doesn't it? And the research points us to a massive, undeniable breaking point: government failure. We actually need to shift our focus upwards here, because the data definitively shows that xenophobic attitudes are heavily, almost inextricably, linked to a profound frustration with the state.
Just think about what it's actually like to live in a community that feels entirely trapped and ignored. These communities genuinely believe the government is fundamentally failing them. They feel that elected leaders simply do not listen anymore, and that the delivery of basic, life-sustaining services, things like water and electricity,
is just hopelessly inadequate. They essentially feel like they have absolutely zero voice in the system. So what happens to a community full of boiling, completely unheard anger? Well, it triggers a core psychological mechanism called scapegoating. This is basically when aggression, caused by immense frustration, is redirected away from its actual source and onto an innocent, usually weaker, third party. All that anger meant for the state, it goes sideways, and it lands directly on African immigrants. Let's see how this builds into this tragic, honestly undeniable pipeline. Step 1. Citizens experience deep poverty, zero mobility, and just utter hopelessness. Step 2. That despair morphs into intense anger directed at a failing government. But, you can't exactly punch a government, right? So we reach Step 3. Redirected aggression. That internal structural despair suddenly turns into external physical violence against the absolute most accessible target. Yet psychological frustration alone doesn't just spontaneously start a riot. People sitting in their living rooms feeling angry don't magically appear in the streets at the exact same time. So, how does silent, simmering frustration actually turn into a coordinated mob?
The answer is mobilization. The data highlights exactly how existing community structures get completely co-opted. Every day, community policing meetings in the townships actually become these organizing points for collective action. Politically active individuals step in to help coordinate the crowds. And perhaps most tragically, inflammatory statements from political leaders act as the match that ignites this highly flammable environment. The violence isn't spontaneous at all. It is highly organized.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this. By finally identifying the true drivers, poverty, inequality, and government failure, we can completely dismantle any lingering blame being placed on the victims. The research just destroys our false assumptions. The size of the immigrant population in a municipality? It doesn't trigger the violence. Cultural differences? They don't trigger the violence. The data proves once and for all that xenophobia isn't actually driven by the foreigners themselves. No way.
Understanding this completely shifts our entire perspective. If we finally recognize what the data is telling us about the true nature of this disease, the next big question is, how do we actually go about breaking the cycle and fixing the issue?
Well, the solutions definitely aren't what the political talking points usually suggest. Throwing more police on the streets or passing stricter national immigration laws will ultimately fail because they're just treating the symptoms. To actually cure this, society must address extreme lived poverty. It has to tackle the systemic inequality that causes that relative deprivation we talked about. And above all, it has to demand genuine government accountability. Until that broken system is fixed, this horrific cycle of scapegoating is just going to continue.
Which brings us to the final, really unavoidable truth hidden in all these numbers. Xenophobia isn't really about foreigners at all. It's about what happens when a society simply runs out of hope. When a community feels completely and utterly abandoned, who ultimately pays the price? It's a tough question, but an important one. Keep questioning the consensus, and thank you so much for joining this explainer.